Welcome to my room, I guess. As part of the Chain Challenge, this is my first video blog on reviewing my paper. So today for the first vlog, what I've chosen is a paper on composting. As some of you may or may not know, I'm also doing a secondary chain challenge with my friend Sandra, and we're trying to implement a composting system in the engineering building. So keeping in touch with the theme, I've decided, okay, might as well start with a paper on composting. So this paper is called The Use of Compost in Urban Green Areas, and it is a review of the practical applications. The paper was first published in 2006 under the Journal of Urban Forestry and Urban Greening, and the authors are Sabo and Farini. The paper is basically 101 on composting: what's good, what's bad, what you should do, what not to do. So just the do's and don'ts of composting. So it's a pretty basic idea on composting, but it gives you a very good background on what composting is and what you should and should not do. The paper starts off with an introduction on urban systems, for example, cities and heavily populated areas, and how composting may be beneficial to these areas. At the same time, the paper talks about how composting can be detrimental in some circumstances. So, yeah, that is true. Composting may not be the holy grail solution of going green. Sometimes it's bad, but we'll talk about that a bit later. The paper starts off by saying that there are two main applications to composting. You can either use it as a soil amendment, so you mix it up with the soil and use it as a growth media, or you can use it as mulch, in which case, again, you're using it as a soil additive, but this is different from a soil amendment in the sense that mulch is only the top layer. You don't mix it through the entire medium, and mulch is mainly there to prevent weed growth and add organic matter to the top layer of the soil, which again is beneficial to plants. However, the paper goes on to say that adding extreme amounts of compost can be bad for plant health. So, for example, if I were to add more than 50% of compost to a soil additive, it might be beneficial to some plants. However, going above 50% may be detrimental, and it might actually stunt plant growth. And this was seen in a species of plants called the Angelonia, which is a flowering plant in Mexico. It can be found in Mexico. It's got really nice flowers. I had to Google it and see how nice it was. However, in the case of the Angelonia, what they saw was adding more than 50%, bordering on 80% compost to the soil was actually detrimental. And in the case of the Colorado spruce, so the spruce trees, if you add more than 20% compost as mulch, it just stops growth altogether. So it's essential to understand that compost may not be the solution to everything. However, in the urban environment, for example, cities, compost does have other advantages. For example, it can also be used to reduce the environmental load. So if you're composting organic matter, you're sending less of that to the landfill. So overall, you're reducing the environmental burden, the organic load and the environmental burden on the overall city. Composting also has a few other criteria. So you can't only look at adding compost as a soil additive without first checking its quality, how stable it is, what is its pH, and how much water is in the compost. So these are the four main things that you're looking at. So starting with the quality of the compost. Now, when you prepare compost, remember that you're not the only one handling the compost. Once you put the compost in the bins and the city takes the bin to its facility, there are workers handling the compost in those facilities to be made into a soil additive or into another organic matter which is beneficial to plants. So these workers, you have to keep in mind that whatever you put in those bins, these workers are exposed to it as well. So the quality of the compost is essential to determine what the health effects, what the detrimental health effects might be to the workers. At the same time, if you mix a lot of different things and you put it in the compost, so say for example you mix food waste with some other waste materials, for example recycling and things like that, it reduces the overall quality of the compost, because then you end up with large particles in the compost which cannot be composted completely. This again leads to very minimal water infiltration into the soil, so it reduces the overall moisture level in the soil, and this again is not good for plants. If you have hazardous materials in the compost, this can be taken up by the plant, so it leads to phytotoxicity. And remember, it finally ends up in you. So you have to be careful about what are the things that you put in. Finally, looking at the stability of compost, some people may start composting and before the process is even finished, they say, okay, the compost is done, let's put it in the soil. This is not really great, because if you don't allow the entire process to finish, then the composting will go on, it will continue when it's added to the soil, and the soil temperatures might actually go up to 60 degrees, which isn't that great. It will lead to the death of the roots of the plants. So how do you know when your composting is done? Some people say, okay, check the CN ratio. Whatever the CN ratio is, the higher the nitrogen ratio in the compost, maybe the better it is. However, that's not such a good argument to make. And there are new papers coming out, new publications coming out that actually says that the CN ratio is not a good measure of assuming or of actually seeing if the compost is done. The nitrogen ratio in that CN, the nitrogen ratio has a maximum. If you apply more than 120 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, again, it's actually detrimental to plants. So just saying that the higher or the lower the CN ratio, the better, that's not actually true. So then, what is a good measure of saying whether the compost is done or not? Well, some people are actually measuring the amount of oxygen that the compost takes in and the amount of carbon dioxide that's given out. So then that gas measurement allows you to see whether the compost is complete or not. So those are some of the different techniques people are using. The water content in the compost, the average water content or the water content that is desirable is 45 to 55%. And at no point should you let the water content go down below 35. And the reason for that is if it goes below 35, it creates a dry environment for the microbes. And microbes only live in biofilms. You want microbes there. Microbes are the ones that allow the enrichment of the soil. So if it goes below 35, you don't have that biofilm, hence you don't have microbes growing in it. Some people do argue that, okay, the microbes may be bad for the plants. For example, you might have bad bugs in the plants. But if you do a proper composting and the compost temperatures actually go up above 60 and around the 80-degree region, so I'm talking about Celsius again, if you do a proper compost, some of the bad or most of the bad microbes will actually die. So overall, composting is really good for the environment. So in this case, what I did find interesting, there was this one value that popped up, was in the European Union, the EU is trying to reduce the amount of organic waste that is going to its landfill. And the targets that it has set is 20% by, let me see again, by 2010 and 50% by 2050. So the EU is trying to reduce 50% of the organic waste going to the landfill by 2050. I haven't yet checked up on how it's doing, if it's meeting its goals or not, but maybe in future publications I'll see values or I'll look for values. But to help the EU, again, like I said at the beginning of my blog, Sandra and I are doing a composting regime. We're trying to implement a composting regime at the engineering department of Cambridge University. We're trying to do our 2 cents. So I have posted another post in my blog this week to tell you guys how that's going, so read up on that. And again, fingers crossed, hopefully that works out. That's it for me for this week, and hopefully I'll see you guys next week again.